The morning sun peeked through the steamy windows of Golden Cup Diner, casting long shadows across the checkered floor. It was 6:30 a.m., and May had already memorized the rhythm of another day. The bell of the door chimed its familiar tune as early birds stumbled in, seeking their first cup of coffee. For 15 years, May's feet had traced the same paths between these worn leather booths, but there was something special about her movements that caught everyone's eye. She never dropped a plate, not even once. Her hands seemed to dance through the air, gracefully balancing plates of steaming eggs and towers of pancakes as if they were lightweight as feathers. "Order up," called out Mr. Wong from the kitchen window, his voice mixing with the sizzle of bacon and the gentle clink of coffee cups. May glided forward, her well-worn sneakers silent against the floor. She gathered 6 plates along her arms, a feat that always made new customers hold their breath. There was something almost magical about how she did it, like a street performer who had mastered an impossible trick. "Coming through," she called softly, weaving between tables with the precision of someone who knew every square inch of space by heart. The regulars at table 7 paused their conversation to watch her pass, still amazed after all these years. She could feel their eyes following her, but her focus never wavered. Mrs. Kim at the counter always said Mai must have a sixth sense. Somehow, she knew exactly when someone's coffee cup was running low, appearing with the pot before they could even look up. She could tell when the quiet businessman in the corner needed space to work on his laptop, or when the elderly couple by the window wanted someone to chat with about their grandchildren. The morning rush was like a carefully choreographed dance, and May was the lead performer. Between refilling sugar dispensers and jotting down orders, she noticed everything. The young student struggling to stay awake over her textbooks, the truck driver who'd been on the road all night, the construction worker treating himself to breakfast before a long day. "How do you do it?" people would often ask, watching her navigate the busy diner with such ease. May would just smile, her eyes twinkling with a hint of mystery. Truth was, she saw beauty in this everyday ballet. Each order delivered, each table cleared, each customer served was part of a bigger picture. A community coming together over warm food and friendly faces. The locals called her the guardian angel of Golden Cup, though she brushed off such praise with a modest wave. To her, this wasn't just a job. Every plate she carried was a story, every table a chapter in the ongoing tale of small-town life. She knew which regulars were celebrating birthdays, who had just become grandparents, who was going through tough times and needed their coffee with an extra side of kindness. That morning, like every morning, she moved through the diner with grace that seemed almost supernatural. But there was nothing supernatural about it, just years of practice, attention to detail, and genuine care for every person who walked through that door. Her secret wasn't in her careful balance or quick steps, but in how she turned simple acts of service into something extraordinary. As the morning sun climbed higher, casting golden light across the busy diner, Mai continued her dance between the tables. She didn't know it yet, but her gifted hands would soon lead her down an unexpected path, one where her everyday grace would transform into something more. But for now, she was exactly where she needed to be, turning an ordinary morning into something special for everyone lucky enough to be there. After the last customer left the diner each night, May would climb the creaky stairs to her small apartment above Wong's hardware store. The space might have been tiny, but to her, it was a treasure chest of memories and dreams. As soon as she stepped through the door, the smell of coffee and fried eggs was replaced by the gentle scent of paper and jasmine tea. The living room walls were alive with color and shape. Hundreds of paper creations caught the evening light, casting delicate shadows that danced as the breeze filtered through her open window. Cranes in flight hung from strings near the ceiling, their wings seeming to flutter with each gust of wind. Dragons in brilliant reds and golds curled around her lampshade, while delicate cherry blossoms bloomed across her bookshelf. Tonight, like many nights before, May settled into her favorite spot. a worn armchair by the window that overlooked Main Street. Her fingers, which had spent the day carrying plates and pouring coffee, now moved with different purpose. From a drawer beside her, she pulled out special paper her grandmother had sent from their hometown in China. The paper was thin as silk but strong as cloth, with subtle patterns that shimmered in the lamplight. As she began to fold, memories of her childhood flooded back. She could almost hear her grandmother's gentle voice. "Patience, little one. The paper will tell you where it wants to go." Back then, they would sit together in the early morning light, folding birds and flowers while steam rose from cups of green tea. Her grandmother's hands had been small but strong, weathered by years of creating beauty from simple squares of paper. May's current project was especially challenging. A life-sized peacock with a tail that would fan out in dozens of intricate folds. She'd been working on it for weeks, each evening adding new feathers, each one more detailed than the last. The coffee table in front of her was covered with precisely cut squares of paper in shades of blue, green, and gold. Between folds, she sipped her tea and watched the street below. The hardware store's neon sign painted everything in a soft purple glow, and she could see Mr. Wong closing up for the night, just as he had for the past 20 years. This quiet moment was different from her busy days at the diner, but it held its own kind of magic. Her apartment had become something of a paper forest over the years. In the kitchen, tiny paper mice peeked out from behind the sugar jar. The bathroom mirror was framed with a chain of perfectly folded lotus flowers. Even her bedroom ceiling was covered in stars she'd folded during sleepless nights, each one containing a wish or a dream written inside before the final fold. Some people might have called it cluttered, but to Mai, each creation held a story. The row elephants marching across her windowsill marked the days she'd spent teaching her young niece how to fold. The garden of paper roses blooming on her coffee table commemorated her parents' anniversary. Every piece was a moment frozen in time, captured in creases and folds. As the evening grew later, May's fingers continued their dance with the paper. Under the warm light of her reading lamp, the peacock's tail grew feather by feather. She didn't need music. The soft rustle of paper, the distant hum of traffic below, and the occasional meow from her neighbor's cat created their own gentle symphony. This was her secret world, one that none of her diner customers knew about. Here, she wasn't just the reliable waitress with the steady hands. Here, she was an artist, a keeper of traditions, a creator of small miracles in paper. Sometimes, during busy shifts at the diner, she would feel a paper crane rustling in her apron pocket, a small reminder of this other life, this other self that bloomed in the quiet hours after sunset. What she didn't know was that soon these two worlds, the public and the private, the practical and the artistic, would collide in ways she never expected. But for now, she was content in this moment, watching another paper feather take shape beneath her fingers, adding one more story to her collection of folded dreams. Every Tuesday morning, like clockwork, the bell above the diner door would chime at exactly 7:15. The tall man with silver-streaked hair and wire-rimmed glasses would take his usual spot in booth number 4, always carrying a worn leather briefcase filled with papers. Everyone knew him as Professor Lai from the local university's art department, though he insisted people just call him Tom. For 3 years, his order had never changed. 2 eggs over easy, whole wheat toast with no butter, and black coffee that Mai somehow kept perfectly hot without him ever having to ask. It was like a weekly ritual, performed with such precision that other regulars could set their watches by his visits. This particular Tuesday started like any other. The professor was grading papers, red pen moving steadily across student essays about Renaissance art, while Mai kept his coffee cup full with her usual silent efficiency. But something was different today. A gentle breeze from the open window caught the edge of her apron, and out fluttered something that looked like a shimmer of gold. The professor's quick eyes caught the movement. There, on the checkered floor, lay an intricate paper crane, its wings touched with gold leaf, barely larger than a thumbnail. Before Mai could reach for it, he had already picked it up, holding it with the careful touch of someone who understood delicate things. "This is extraordinary," he said, turning the tiny crane in the morning light. "The precision in these folds. The paper quality. This isn't ordinary origami." His voice held the quiet excitement of someone who had just discovered a hidden treasure. Mai felt her cheeks warm as she reached to take the crane back, but the professor wasn't finished examining it. "The technique here reminds me of the modern masters in Kyoto," he continued, "but there's something unique about the style." "Who made this?" The diner had grown quieter, other regulars pretending not to listen while straining to hear every word. Mai shifted from one foot to another, the coffee pot still warm in her hand. "It's nothing special," she said softly. "Just something I do to pass the time." The professor looked up from the crane to May's face, then back to the crane, as if seeing both of them clearly for the first time. "Nothing special." He shook his head slowly. "Do you have any idea how rare this level of skill is? The way you've incorporated the gold leaf into the final fold without breaking the paper's fiber, that's masterful." More cranes filled May's apron pocket, along with a half-finished lotus flower she'd been working on during her break. The professor's enthusiasm drew them out, one by one, each piece telling its own story. There was a dragon no bigger than a postage stamp, scales detailed with the finest of folds. A butterfly with wings so thin they were almost transparent. Each piece made the professor's eyes grow wider. "You know," he said, carefully arranging the pieces on his paper placemat, "the university gallery is planning an exhibition called Hidden Masters next month. It's meant to showcase unknown artists in our community who deserve recognition." He paused, looking up at May. "Would you consider?" But before he could finish, the cook's bell rang sharply. "Order up," called Mr. Wong's voice from the kitchen. Mai quickly gathered her paper creatures, tucking them safely away. "I need to." She gestured toward the kitchen. Of course," the professor nodded, but his eyes followed her as she moved away. He pulled a business card from his briefcase, placing it beside his coffee cup. "Think about it," he called after her. "Art like this deserves to be seen." Throughout the rest of her shift, May could feel the weight of that business card in her apron pocket, right next to her paper creatures. It sat there like a key to a door she'd never thought about opening. Her hands moved through their usual routine, carrying plates, wiping tables, pouring coffee. But her mind kept drifting to her apartment upstairs, to the hundreds of paper creatures that had been her private joy for so long. The professor left his usual tip, but today it sat beside a small note. Art isn't meant to stay hidden forever. Sometimes it needs to fly free, just like your cranes. As Mai cleared his table, she noticed he'd left something else too. A tiny paper boat, clearly folded by less experienced hands than her own, but made with great care. She smiled, tucking it into her pocket alongside her cranes. Maybe, just maybe, it was time for her private paper world to spread its wings. For 3 days, the professor's business card sat untouched on May's kitchen counter. She'd prop it against her tea kettle in the morning, tuck it away in a drawer by lunch, then pull it out again in the evening. The simple white card with its black letters seemed to grow larger each time she looked at it, like a paper mountain she wasn't sure she could climb. "Hidden Masters Exhibition," she whispered to herself while folding another crane, this one from a scrap of newspaper. The words felt strange in her mouth, too grand for someone who spent her days refilling coffee cups and writing down breakfast orders. During her shifts at the diner, she found herself watching people's hands more closely than ever before. The construction worker with paint-stained fingers who could still sketch beautiful buildings on napkins. The retired mechanic whose rough hands were surprisingly gentle when helping his wife with her coat. The young mother who could type one-handed on her laptop while cradling her baby. Everyone had their own kind of art, their own hidden talents. One quiet afternoon, Mrs. Wu, who'd owned the flower shop across the street for 30 years, noticed May's distraction. "Something's on your mind," she said, stirring her tea. It wasn't a question. You've poured creamer in my cup 3 times, and I always take it black. Mai blinked, reaching for a clean cup to fix her mistake. But Mrs. Wu caught her wrist gently. Sit down for a minute. She patted the empty booth beside her. The other customers can wait. The diner was nearly empty anyway. Just a couple of high school students sharing fries in the corner. Mai slid into the booth, her apron crinkling as she sat. Without thinking, her fingers reached for a paper napkin, automatically starting to fold it. Professor Lai came to my shop yesterday, Mrs. Wu continued, watching Mai's hands move. He told me about your paper art. Said it was museum quality. She smiled at Mai's surprised look. This is a small town, dear. Good news travels fast. The napkin in Mai's hands had become a simple flower. I don't know if I can do it, she admitted quietly. Show my work to everyone. It's always been just mine, my private thing. Mrs. Wu was quiet for a moment, sipping her fresh cup of tea. You know, she finally said, I felt the same way when I first opened my shop. Back then, women didn't often own businesses here. My husband said I was crazy to leave my safe job at the bank, but sometimes the scariest choices turn out to be the best ones. Through the diner's big front window, Mai could see the flower shop's colorful display. It was always changing with the seasons, always beautiful. But what if people don't like them? She asked, voicing her deepest fear. What if they think they're just paper toys? Oh, honey, Mrs. Wu chuckled, picking up the napkin flower Mai had made. Look at this. You made this without even thinking, while worried and distracted, and it's still beautiful. Imagine what you could do when you're really trying. Just then, Mr. Wong poked his head out from the kitchen. Instead of his usual call for orders, though, he smiled. Mai, he said, take tomorrow afternoon off. I heard about the exhibition thing. He winked. Time to show everyone what those magic hands can really do. Word had spread through the diner like warm butter on toast. Throughout the day, customers kept stopping by her station, sharing encouraging words. The high school art teacher left a book about Japanese paper art. A retired cabinet maker offered to build display stands for her pieces. Even the quiet businessman who always sat in the corner handed her a business card for his sister's art supply store, mentioning a friends and family discount. That evening, Mai stood in her apartment, surrounded by her paper menagerie. Cranes and dragons, flowers and butterflies. Each piece held a memory, a moment, a piece of her heart. The professor's card was in her hand again, but it didn't seem so intimidating anymore. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling just slightly as she dialed the number. Professor Lai, this is Mai, from the diner, she said softly. About the exhibition. I think I'd like to try. As she spoke, a breeze from the open window made all her paper creatures dance, as if celebrating her decision. Through the phone, she could hear the professor's warm smile in his voice as he began to share his vision for showcasing her art. The paper mountain didn't seem quite so high anymore. Instead, it looked more like a bridge, one she was finally ready to cross. The next few weeks brought changes to the Golden Cup diner that nobody could have predicted. The usual morning rush still came and went, but there was something different in the air. A sense of excitement that bubbled up like fresh coffee in the pot. Mr. Wong had rearranged the work schedule, giving Mai 3 afternoons off each week to prepare for the exhibition. Can't let our local artists burn out, he'd say with a proud grin. Word spread through town like wildfire, and soon Mai's regular customers started bringing her special papers from their travels. The retired couple who always shared a slice of apple pie brought delicate sheets from their trip to Japan. The traveling salesman who stopped by every Thursday presented her with handmade paper from India, its edges trimmed in gold. Even the teenagers who came in for after-school fries pooled their allowances to buy her a book of premium origami paper. Mai's tiny apartment above the hardware store had transformed into an artist's studio. She'd cleared the living room furniture to make space for her largest project yet, a life-sized paper garden. Paper flowers bloomed across her coffee table, while delicate butterflies hung from fishing line near the windows. Each piece was carefully planned to tell a story about her journey from the busy diner below to this new world of art she was creating. The local craft store owner, Mrs. Chen, began stopping by during the afternoon lull. She'd sit at the counter, sipping green tea and sharing tips about art display and lighting. "You need to think about how people will move through the space," she'd explain, sketching quick diagrams on napkins. "Each piece should lead to the next, like stepping stones in a garden." One rainy Tuesday, Professor Lai brought a photographer from the university newspaper. May's hands trembled slightly as she showed them her work, but the photographer's genuine amazement put her at ease. "These aren't just paper sculptures," the young woman said, adjusting her camera lens. "They're stories folded into art." The whole town seemed to be holding its breath with anticipation. Regular customers would ask for updates during their morning coffee runs. "How's the exhibition coming along?" They'd say, genuine interest warming their voices. "We can't wait to see what you've been creating up there." Mai found herself working late into the night, her hands moving with purpose as she folded increasingly complex designs. She created a paper dragon that spiraled up from a coffee cup, its scales shimmering with tiny details. She fashioned delicate paper chains that looked like floating cherry blossoms, each petal individually folded and connected with invisible thread. But her centerpiece was something special, a paper recreation of the diner itself, complete with tiny folded customers sitting in booths, miniature plates of food, and even a small paper version of herself carrying trays with impossible grace. It was her way of honoring the place and people who had supported her all these years. The local high school art club asked if they could help with the installation. Mai found herself surrounded by eager teenagers after school, teaching them basic folds while they helped her organize pieces for display. "It's like magic," one young girl said, watching May turn a square of paper into a perfect rose. "How do you make it look so easy?" "It's not magic," May replied, guiding the student's hands through the folds. "It's patience and practice. Just like serving customers or learning to dance. You start with the simple steps and build from there." As the exhibition date drew closer, May's nervousness began to transform into excitement. Each morning at the diner felt different now. She was no longer just the waitress with the steady hands. Customers looked at her differently, with a new kind of respect in their eyes. But she made sure their coffee cups stayed full and their orders arrived hot, just as they always had. One evening, as she was closing up the diner, she caught her reflection in the window. She was still wearing her familiar apron, but tucked in its pocket were her latest paper creations. A reminder that she was both the person she'd always been and someone new she was becoming. The street lights outside made the window into a mirror, and for a moment, she could see both versions of herself, the reliable waitress and the blossoming artist, finally learning to coexist. The university gallery had never seen such a diverse crowd for an opening night. Doctors stood next to truck drivers, teachers chatted with mechanics, and college students mingled with retirees. The usual whispered conversations of art openings were replaced by the warm buzz of a community celebration. Everyone from the Golden Cup diner had come to support their favorite waitress. May stood near the entrance, wearing a simple blue dress instead of her familiar apron. Her hands, usually so steady with plates and coffee pots, fidgeted with her sleeve as she watched people move through the space. The gallery had been transformed into a paper wonderland. Delicate lights cast soft shadows that made her creations seem to dance and flutter in the evening air. "You've got to see this," she heard someone say, leading their friends toward the centerpiece. There, in the middle of the gallery, stood her paper recreation of the diner. Every detail was perfect, from the tiny napkin dispensers to the miniature coffee cups, each no bigger than a fingernail. Visitors bent close, pointing out little details, the way the paper steam seemed to rise from the cups, the tiny menu cards with microscopic writing, even the pattern of the floor tiles recreated in carefully folded paper. Mr. Wong arrived still wearing his cook's apron, bringing with him the warm smell of the kitchen. "Couldn't close early," he explained, "but I brought something special." He unveiled a tray of his famous almond cookies, arranged to look like maize paper flowers. The gesture brought tears to her eyes. Near the window, a group gathered around her series of working hands captured in paper. A mechanic's hands holding tools, a teacher's hands writing on a blackboard, a grandmother's hands knitting. Each piece was crafted from paper, but held the weight of real life within its folds. "That's my hands," the local mechanic exclaimed, recognizing himself in the art. "She got the oil stain on my thumb just right." The high school art students who had helped with the installation proudly guided visitors through the exhibition. "See how the light catches these edges," one explained, pointing to a paper crane. "She taught us that folding with the grain of the paper makes it catch the light differently." Professor Lai moved through the crowd, beaming like a proud uncle. "The technique is extraordinary," he explained to some visiting art critics, "but it's the humanity in each piece that makes it special. Look at how she's captured the essence of community in every fold." In one corner, Mai had recreated her grandmother's hands, teaching her to fold her first crane. The piece was simple, just two pairs of hands formed from white paper, but visitors stood before it in silence, many wiping away tears. They recognized the universal story of knowledge passed down through generations, of love expressed through patient teaching. "I never knew," Mrs. Wu from the flower shop whispered, squeezing May's hand. "All those years watching you carry plates, and we never knew you were carrying all this beauty inside too." The local newspaper photographer couldn't stop taking pictures, especially of the installation May called "A Day at the Diner." Paper customers sat in paper booths, served by a paper waitress whose tiny hands held impossibly detailed plates of food. "The way you've captured the morning light through the windows," the photographer said, "it's like you've frozen a moment in time." As the evening went on, May began to relax. She watched as children pointed excitedly at the paper animals, as elderly couples held hands while examining her work, as younger artists scribbled furiously in their notebooks. Her two worlds, the diner and her art, had finally merged into something entirely new. Near closing time, a young girl tugged at her dress. "Can you teach me?" she asked, holding up a crumpled attempt at a paper crane. Maya knelt down beside her, gently helping her smooth out the paper. "Of course," she smiled, beginning the familiar folds. Soon a small crowd gathered to watch, and Maya felt herself slipping naturally into the role of teacher, just as her grandmother had done so many years ago. The gallery lights dimmed, signaling the end of the opening, but no one seemed ready to leave. The paper world May had created held them all in its gentle embrace, a testament to the extraordinary beauty that can be found in ordinary lives and the art that exists in every pair of working hands. 6 months after the exhibition, the Golden Cup Diner had changed in subtle but significant ways. Paper cranes now danced from fishing line above each booth, catching the morning sunlight and casting delicate shadows on the tables below. The walls, once decorated with faded photographs, now showcased framed pieces of May's art, each one telling a story of the diner and its regular customers. May still carried plates with her characteristic grace, but now she wore a special apron designed by the high school art club. They had embroidered it with tiny cranes and flowers, matching the paper art that had made their town's diner famous. Tour buses sometimes stopped by, filled with people who had read about the origami waitress in art magazines or seen viral videos of her work online. Every Wednesday afternoon, the diner transformed into an informal art studio. May would push the tables together, laying out sheets of colorful paper while regulars and visitors gathered to learn. The retired mechanics sat next to college students, their hands all equally clumsy at first as they learned the basic folds. Even Mr. Wong would emerge from his kitchen, wiping flour from his hands to try creating a paper version of his famous cherry pie. "Remember," May would say, moving around the table to help each person, "every crease tells a story. There's no such thing as a mistake, just a different path for the paper to take. Her words, soft but sure, carried the wisdom of someone who had found her own unexpected path. The local elementary school invited her for special art classes. She would arrive with boxes of paper in rainbow colors, watching children's eyes light up as she transformed simple squares into birds and animals. My grandmother taught me that patience is the key, she'd tell them, helping small hands master each fold. Just like learning to write or ride a bike, one step at a time. Her paper art had begun appearing in unexpected places around town. The library displayed her paper books with pages that seemed to turn in an invisible wind. The flower shop's window featured her botanical creations alongside real blooms, making passersby do double takes to tell which was which. The hospital's children's ward had a whole wall of her paper animals, bringing color and joy to young patients. One morning, as Maya served coffee to her regular customers, a young woman she didn't recognize came in clutching a newspaper. "I took a bus for 3 hours to get here," she said, pushing back her sleeve to reveal arms covered in burned scars. "I read about how you found your art while waiting tables. I'm a cook, and I've been hiding my hands, but your story made me think maybe I could create something beautiful too." Maya sat with her during the quiet hours between breakfast and lunch, teaching her the basic folds. The woman's scared hands moved carefully, determinedly, until a slightly crooked but perfectly meaningful crane sat on the table between them. "It's not about perfect shapes," May told her. "It's about putting your heart into each fold." The diner had become more than just a place to eat. It was a gathering spot for people seeking to discover their own hidden talents. The wall near the register was covered with paper creations left by customers, each one accompanied by a small note about the maker's journey. "First time doing art since high school, read one." "Made this while waiting for my job interview," said another. "Folded with my granddaughter," proclaimed a third. May's apartment above the hardware store was still her private studio, but now she left her windows open more often, letting her paper creations catch the light and share their beauty with the street below. Sometimes children would stand on the sidewalk, pointing up at the paper dragons and butterflies that seemed to dance in the breeze. Tour companies contacted her about teaching workshops, and art galleries in bigger cities asked about exhibitions. But Maya always smiled and politely declined. Her heart belonged to the diner, to the community that had supported her, to the daily dance of serving coffee while sharing her art with anyone who wanted to learn. "You could be famous in the big city," Professor Lai said one morning over his usual breakfast. May just smiled, refilling his coffee cup with her characteristic precision. "I already have everything I need right here," she replied, watching the young girl at another table carefully folding a napkin into a bird. "Every day, I get to serve food that feeds the body and create art that feeds the soul. What could be better than that?" As if to emphasize her words, the morning sunlight streamed through the windows, making all her paper creations glitter and dance. The diner hummed with the sounds of clinking plates, friendly conversation, and the soft rustle of paper being folded into dreams.